Hi everyone, we're continuing our series of beginner chess videos here on My Chess Notebook. Today's video is all about trading pieces. So the first thing you should know about trading pieces is the difference between a fair trade and an unfair trade. So have a look at the position. It's white to move. Now if white wants to, he can take the knight with his bishop, and that's a 3-point knight. Well, then black can recapture the bishop with his pawn, and that's a 3-point bishop. So each player got 3 points, and we call that a fair trade. So that was an okay thing for white to do. Now take a look at this position. So it's white to move again. Now if white takes the knight with his rook, he's getting 3 points for the knight. But then black recaptures the rook, and the rook's worth 5 points. So that was not a fair trade. That trade benefited black. Black got a 2-point swing in that case. So that means white should not have initiated that trade. That was a mistake. So white has 2 more points of material in this position, but after the trade took place, now it's even. So not a fair trade. Okay, so now that we know what a fair trade is, you may wonder, when do we actually trade pieces? When should we do it? Well, I've noticed over the years that beginners tend to trade pieces too often. They do it every chance they get. Well, let me suggest that you should only be trading pieces if you can think of a reason to do so. And there are 2 basic reasons. One, either you can think of an advantage to trading, it benefits you in some way, and we'll talk about some of those benefits as the video progresses. Or 2, you may trade because if you don't, your opponent will get some kind of an advantage. So in other words, don't trade mindlessly, have a reason to do so. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is a confusing topic for beginners, which is what happens when a lot of pieces converge on the same square and there's a lot of trading that takes place. So take a look at this pawn here on f5. It's white to move, and white is wondering whether he should capture the pawn. So white starts to think about it, and he says, well, if I use my bishop to take the pawn, then he can take my bishop back with his bishop, and then maybe I can take his bishop with my knight, and then he can take my knight with his knight, and then maybe I'm a little confused, because it's too many moves to think through. Well, if that ever happens to you, you can use a really handy rule of thumb. Now this rule of thumb comes with a warning. It's not always true, and I will show you some exceptions, but it's handy nevertheless. The rule of thumb is simply count how many attackers you have on that pawn and count how many defenders your opponent has on the pawn. If you have more attackers than defenders, then it's probably safe to take that pawn. So let's count. So white has 1, 2, 3 attackers on that pawn. And black has 1, 2 defenders. So it's 3-2. So because of that, it actually is safe for white to take the pawn, and he should do so. Now let's say white takes the pawn with his knight. Well, he just gained a point. Well, black has an option. He can trade pieces or not. But if he does, let's see what happens. If he takes our knight, we should recapture, and that's a knight for a knight. And then if black continues to trade, that's okay. He takes our bishop, and we take back. And that's a bishop for a bishop. So we did gain that pawn, and then made some equal trades after that. So it was okay to do so. That benefited us to take that pawn. So we did it because it gave us a material advantage. So counting attackers versus defenders can be really handy. Okay, let's take a look at this position, and I want you to focus on the rook on the d8 square. It's white to move, and white is wondering whether or not to take the rook. Well, let's count attackers and defenders again. And I want to make a new point. This rook in the front here is obviously attacking that rook. So that's 1 attacker. But the rook here doesn't seem to be attacking it because there's a white piece in the way. However, it still counts as an attacker because if white initiates the trade by taking his front rook and capturing the rook, then the rook right behind it will be poised to capture again. So that counts as an attacker. And the queen behind that counts as an attacker too, because once those two rooks in front of the queen trade themselves off, then the queen will be ready to recapture. So all three of those pieces are considered attackers on that rook. So white has 1, 2, 3 attackers. How many defenders does black have? Well, black is defending it with the other rook and with the queen, and that's it. 2 defenders. So again, it's a 3-to-2 situation, and white should definitely take the rook. Let's see what happens. So white should take the rook, and that's a 5-point swing in white's favor. Now, if black takes back to try to restore the material, getting 5 points back, now it's even, white needs to continue to capture. White takes the next rook. So now white's 5 points ahead. And here, if black takes our rook to try to restore the material and get 5 points back, then we finish off this sequence by taking the queen. And we're obviously winning here. So that trade definitely benefited us, and we should do that as the white player. Okay, let's have a look at this position. So this is kind of complicated, and it's black to move, and I want to talk about a couple of issues. When you have a position like this, you need to look around at all the pieces and decide what pieces are attacking what. So you have to look at the whole board. So for example, you'll notice the black knight here is attacking the white pawn. That's one attacker, and the pawn has 0 defenders. So 1 versus 0, maybe black should take the pawn. However, if we look around further, we'll notice that that bishop is under attack. And it's under attack by 2 attackers. Both rooks are attacking that bishop. And it has only 1 defender, the king. So that bishop is in danger, 2 versus 1. So if it's black to move, he shouldn't be worried about this 1-point pawn. He should be worried about that 3-point bishop. He needs to defend it again. He can't move it out of the way because it's pinned. It's in an absolute pin. The rook would be checking the king if the bishop moved. So it needs more defense. 2 attackers versus 1 defender right now. Well, the only way to defend it is to retreat this knight back to the e8 square. So that knight now defends the bishop. So now black does have 2 defenders and white has 2 attackers. So this is a state of equilibrium. White really can't take the bishop and win material. So black is temporarily safe. So let's say white makes some move like he pushes his h-pawn forward. What should black do here? Well, black is kind of tied up. His rook is stuck here, it can't move anywhere. His knight doesn't want to move because it's protecting the bishop. The bishop can't move because it's pinned. Maybe black can move one of his pawns, but the best move for black is to move his king to the corner, which still defends the bishop. And the reason for that is now we're not in a pin. That bishop can move if it wants to. Also, the rook can slide over and defend the bishop. And there's no more pin. So that would be a good way to release a lot of the pressure and make your pieces more mobile. Okay, let's move on to this position. And this is an exception to the rule of counting attackers versus defenders. So take a look at the black pawn in the middle of the board on the e5 square. White is attacking it with both rooks, so there are 2 attackers. But black only has 1 defender. Okay. However, should white take that pawn, 2 versus 1? In this case, no, because white has only these major pieces attacking the pawn, these 2 rooks, which are worth 5 points each, and black has this minor piece, this 3-point knight defending it. So yes, white can win the pawn, but not at a very good cost, because black will take the rook and you will get the knight. And so you got two pieces, the knight and the pawn, but black got a rook. And a rook is 5 points, and a knight and a pawn total 4 points. So that trade actually benefited black. In fact, if you look at the board here, the material is perfectly equal, but before the trade, if you count material, you'll find out that white is ahead 1 point. So white lost a point in that particular sequence of trades. So this idea of counting attackers and defenders doesn't work if your pieces are more valuable than the defenders, if your attackers are more valuable than the defenders. Okay, so let's take a look at this position. So now I want to talk about some possible reasons why you might make a fair trade, an equal trade. So in this position, white is attacking the knight with the bishop, and the knight's defended with the pawn. So white could take the knight, and black could recapture, and that would be a fair trade. But you remember earlier I mentioned you should only be making fair trades if you can think of a reason to do so. Well, one reason to make a fair trade is to gain time. To gain time. In a game of chess, it's very important to be able to force your opponent to respond, giving you an additional move. And in this case, if we take the knight, black would have to recapture unless he wants to be down material. Okay, he doesn't want to lose 3 points for nothing. So while black is forced to recapture, then we have our eye on something else. We want to do something else in return. Do you see what it is? Okay, white should definitely initiate this trade, because if black recaptures, then white has a checkmate with the rook. That's a checkmate right there. The king has nowhere to run to. So we gained time by making that trade. That rook was blocked initially down this file by his own bishop, so he wants to move the bishop out of the way and then checkmate black. Should he move the bishop here? He could, but that doesn't gain time because now black can defend. For example, black can push a pawn, and then this is no longer a checkmate because the king can slip out. So getting out of the way of the rook is one idea, but getting out of the way while capturing is a better idea because that gains time. Now either black recaptures and gets checkmated, or he defends against the checkmate somehow like that, and then white retreats his bishop to safety. And now white got 3 points and black wasn't able to recapture. So that's a good reason to trade, is to gain time. Let's have another look at that. Okay, in this position, if it were white to move, white could take the knight with the bishop, and then black can recapture with the pawn, and that would be a fair trade. I can't really think of an advantage to doing so, though, as the white player. In fact, I think that's a disadvantage to do that, because right here, white's bishop is very active. It's doing something. It has a job. It's pinning the knight. The knight is in an absolute pin. That knight isn't going anywhere because it's pinned. So it doesn't make much sense to trade off the active bishop for the pinned knight. However, suppose it's black's move. Now, black can play bishop here, which unpins the knight, so it's no longer in a pin. And that means the knight is now attacking the queen. Okay, well, what are white's options? White can retreat the queen somewhere, or maybe a better move is now to initiate a trade. Because if white initiates the trade here and black recaptures somehow, then white can keep their queen in the middle of the board there, where it exerts a lot of pressure, and make another move. So white gained time by not retreating their queen. So that's a good reason to trade a piece. Okay, let's have a look at an opening, a common opening where white can gain some time by trading. Okay, one opening is pawn to e4, and then black responds pawn to d5. This is called the Scandinavian opening, by the way. And black is offering white a trade of pawns. Now white should probably accept the trade and take the pawn, and then black recaptures with the queen. And that's a fair trade, 1 point for 1 point. But the reason white does that is because now white can use this knight to attack the queen, forcing the queen to move a second time. And it has to move somewhere, like maybe here, and that means white has gained time. So white was able to get a piece into the game while attacking that queen, all thanks to that trade. Okay, let's have a look at this position. So here it's white to move, and let's say white uses their knight to attack black's bishop, which is undefended at the moment, so white is threatening to take it. Now here black makes a mistake and decides, okay, instead of moving my bishop out of the way, I'm going to attack black's rook with this pawn. And black's reasoning is, well, if you take my bishop, that's 3 points for you, but then I'm going to get your rook. That's 5 points for me. And even if you get the pawn, that's a total of 4 points for you, but 5 for me. So that trade benefits black. Well, black's thinking there is faulty, because after black attacks the rook, we don't have to take the bishop. We can move the rook. Now, we don't want to just move the rook anywhere. For example, if we move it here to safety, then black can move their bishop to safety and nothing happened. No trades took place. White can do better than that. It was a mistake to attack white's rook because white can initiate a trade here that gains time. White should take the knight. It's a rare case where, now if black takes back, it's a rare case where white actually initiates what looks to be an unfair trade at first, because white is taking a 3-point knight and giving up a 5-point rook. But that's because black's bishop is still hanging over here and white follows up by taking it. So what did white get out of that? Well, white got a knight and a bishop. That's a total of 6 points, and black only got white's rook. That's 5 points. So that trade benefited white. Okay, so it was a mistake for black to attack that white rook. All right, let's have a look at one final position here and give you one more reason why you might want to trade pieces. So it's white to move, and white is winning. White has 2 extra pawns here, so white has more material. Now, another reason to make a fair trade besides gaining time is to simplify the position. Here, if white could force a trade of queens, if white could remove both queens from the board, then black would have nothing left but their king and would never be able to checkmate white, would never be able to threaten white in any way, and white would still have their 2 pawns left, and white would be able to win the game. So what move should white make here in order to force black to trade queens? Go ahead and pause the video and try to find it. So the move white should make here is queen to f3, which is a check, and it forks the black queen. So this really forces black's hand, because if black moves the king out of check, then white will just win the queen. And that's a very easy win for white. So black really has to take the queen, 9 points, and give up 9 points. Fair trade. So it's a fair trade, but white really got something out of it. There was an advantage to making that fair trade because, as I said, black has no more pieces left and can never threaten white. And white should be able to get one of these pawns to promote and get a queen and checkmate black. And the king here is going to help him do that. All right, so simplifying the position is another reason to trade pieces. Okay, well, thanks for watching the video. I hope you learned something, and I look forward to making more.